Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer 40k lore. Well, today, quite unusually, we're going to talk about the Tau. Yeah, we don't cover the Tau much, mostly because the Tau are goddamn boring, and I know that is an uncontroversial statement. Listen, the Tau are the least of GW's factions, largely because they weren't created out of a moment of genuine inspiration, but more so one driven by market access, which turned out to be a bit of a waste. But they do have some neat little interesting things about them still. And one of the best are probably what we're going to talk about today, the Farsight Enclaves, as they tell us a lot about the actual true nature of the Tau. And any discussion about the Farsight Enclaves, of course, have to start with their founder. Although the term founder frankly fails to capture just how important he is to the Farsight Enclaves, who not only wouldn't exist without him, but would certainly have fallen apart very swiftly indeed without his continued and highly unusual existence. I speak, of course, of Commander Farsight O'Shovah. Or to give him his full name and titles, Shaso Viurla Shuva Kais Montir. His early life is, well, basically the classic isekai protagonist backstory. Which, incidentally, I do believe to be a pretty reasonable explanation for his countless exploits, but maybe we'll get to that later. O'Shovah was born on the sept world of Viurla. The planet and surrounding solar system were one of the first occupied by the Tau during their initial expansions into the universe out from their home world, and thus has, by Tau standards, a long and storied history reaching back some, what is it now, nearly a millennia roundabout? More than enough for the Sept world to establish itself a reputation. In this case, due to its warriors, and its ability to produce both fine fighting Tau and the commanders to lead them into battle, as Viurla boasts several prominent military academies, and it was of course at one of these that the young O'Shovah would first cut his teeth and begin his military career as a member of the Fire Caste. He immediately began demonstrating his isekai protagonist powers by not only learning the entirety of the Tau military codex from cover to cover within weeks of arriving, but he then started decrypting and hacking into his superiors' communications channels, using their chatter as a cheat code to inform himself as to their strategies and tactics, allowing him to counter them easily, and rise to prominence quite quickly as an incredibly promising young warrior. Now, the Tau are of course patently retarded when it comes to this for one reason or another, as they don't actually have an officer's academy, and so the young O'Shovah, despite repeatedly demonstrating far beyond regular abilities as a commander of fire warriors, entered the ranks like everybody else as a Shas La, a warrior, a fighter, a frontline grunt. He was dispatched immediately to defeat an unfortunate incursion by aggressive aliens known as the Araken, and judging by GW's usual creativity when it comes to naming things, I'm presuming they were probably giant fucking spiders. Where O'Shovah yet again demonstrated an incredible aptitude for warfare. So much so, in fact, that his commander at the time, Shakanthas, reported him to the Ethereals, claiming that this guy, there's very clearly something wrong with this guy. He's too eager, he's too interested in this, he seems to relish fighting a bit too much. He's gonna go crazy one day. But as he was simply heaping achievement upon achievement upon achievement, nobody back home listened to Shakanthas. And, by the way, this is exactly why I mentioned the isekai protagonist thing, because so far, O'Shovah's backstory practically one-to-one mirrors that of Tanya the Evil. Think about it. Okay, O'Shovah arrives, goes into the military academy where he immediately demonstrates incredible skill, almost as if he knows most of this stuff already, begins outperforming his teachers very swiftly at a young age, and is then sent to the front line where he achieves incredible things, to the point where even his commanders are like, whew, this is a weird one. I better watch myself. Even to the point of writing reports to the superiors to try to warn them about this unusual recruit. And for those of you who have read the manga or watched the anime of Tanya the Evil, remember how she finally helps defeat France by decapitating France's leadership? Well, guess how O'Shovah contributes to the defeat of the Arachne? That's right, assassinating their leadership. I shit ye not. O'Shovah is Tanya the Evil, but blue. Or perhaps it's Tanya, who's O'Shovah, but small and German. We may never know. Anywho, slight deviation aside, after having helped defeat the space spiders, O'Shovah went back home, where he was put through the Trial of Fire. This is basically the Tau equivalent of a promotional test, which they can take multiple times to climb up the ranks and enter into more prestigious lines of service. In this case, O'Shovah needed to undergo a specific test to see if he was willing to sacrifice himself for his comrades. Now, this wasn't technically a test made specifically for O'Shovah, as all of the other contenders during that year's trials had fulfilled the same objective, but it was made mainly with him in mind, as he had made a tremendous number of enemies and or jealous superiors during his climb towards the top, as he'd been, well, actively humiliating them for the last half-decade or so. And because, due to the warnings of Shakanthas, many within the Fire Warrior command structure was looking at O'Shovah with a great deal of doubt. Why would a veteran, proven commander warn so aggressively against allowing this guy to continue to remain in official service? Why would he even indeed go so far as to argue that he should be dismissed with a tremendous degree of prejudice? This was to be then a test to see if O'Shovah was willing and able to put others above himself, if he was truly free of dangerous ego, so to say. Many no doubt hoped that O'Shovah would fail this test, but he fulfilled it to his inspector's satisfaction, and was therefore elevated to the rank of chasseur, and granted the privilege of piloting a Tau battlesuit. Naturally, O'Shovah performed just as excellently whilst equipped with a Gundam as he did on foot as a fire warrior, and earned himself yet further enemies in the Tau command structure, as yet again, 4 years later, when it was time for his second trial by fire, he was once more assigned the passing objective of sacrificing himself in order to save another. Now, this was a bit more of a complex test, because if he passed it, he would be elevated to the potential rank of commander, or at the very least enter into training to become one. But once more, at the end of it all, at the end of a hopeless struggle, O'Shovah, for the second time, apparently dispelled all doubts that he was simply a egomaniac or a brilliant person who would put himself above the collective, and sacrificed his life in a second simulation. Bear you in mind, during these simulation exercises, the person in question has no idea, one, what the objective is, or two, that it is a simulation. So these are genuine sacrifices, at least as far as it goes, anyways. Having demonstrated once more exceptional aptitude for the way of war, he was placed under the tutelage of Commander Puretide, a highly accomplished Tau commander, who put O'Shovah through his paces, but he excelled as always. This was also, by the way, the first time that O'Shovah came to the attention of the Ethereals. See, O'Shovah had already pretty much mastered the Tau way of war when he learned how to read, I presume. And so him being trained was, well, more of a bonus rather than anything else. Okay. Slightly facetious, but he did very well, let's put it like that. So well, indeed, that he had quite a bit of spare time left over. Spare time that he spent attending countless Earth-cast lectures on recent developments in military hardware, weaponry, crises battle suits, artillery systems, anything and everything. O'Shovah was making himself into a near full-time student of advanced military technology, not only of its applications in terms of strategy and tactics, but its operation, its creation, and its continued development. Now, this would obviously be quite useful, one would think, for a commander to understand the nature, the capabilities, and the limitations of the weapons at their disposal. But there is a reason why Tau society is so highly classified around castes. Earth castes, which are the ones developing the weapons, etc., are not really supposed to be interacting over much with the fire caste, who do the fighting. They can, hang out, there's no regulations against it. They can learn from one another, absolutely. After all, the Earth caste is making weapons for the fire caste. Their feedback would be valuable, obviously. But if one begins to drift a little bit too far away from one's original caste, that tends to ring rather large alarm bells for the Ethereals. However, considering O'Shovah's brilliant career up until that point and the high expectations placed upon him, nothing was done. O'Shovah would continue his isekai protagonist lifestyle for a while longer, including arm wrestling some famous characters within the setting, or, sword fighting, but you get the drift, including Cato Sicarius, of all goddamn people, and wiping out a Space Marine chapter. O'Shovah's backstory is quite the thing. Oh, and he also became a Cornet Lord for a second. that part deserves expanding upon, though. Okay, so, after the whole Damocles Gulf crusade thing, where O'Shovah was indeed leading his own fire warriors against the forces of the Imperium, he launched various reclamation efforts to repopulate and retake the planets that had been conquered by the Imperium. And since the Imperials were now either not giving a shit or caring more about, Tyranids, there weren't too much hard work involved. Now, the Tau had, their ego had taken a bit of a bruising during the whole Damocles Gulf crusade. That was their oh shit moment, as up until that point, the Tau had largely believed the galaxy was just theirs for the taking, and the handful of scattered savage species out there could either easily be convinced to join the greater good, or could simply be defeated in small-scale military conflicts. Realizing that the majority of the galaxy was already occupied by a massive empire who hated their fucking guts for the fact that they had blue skin and didn't have any noses, that was a rude awakening to the Tau. And one of the many efforts to restore confidence to the Tau Empire was to try to expand in non-imperial directions. One of these was the Farsight Expedition, commanded, of course, by O'Shovah, then known as Commander Farsight. This would be a rather unusual expedition, as the forces dispatched would travel a, by Tau standards, huge distance to create a rather separate force and, presumably, hopefully, series of colonies, which would in turn become the Farsight Enclaves later on, though that was not a part of the Ethereals' plan. Since the Tau did not have access to warp technology or the bullshit faster-than-light nonsense they're currently using, the entire expedition was frozen, which allowed them to live, whilst being transported. They hoped to arrive in an area of space where they could simply just set up shop. Reality was not so kind, however, and it turned out that the Farsight expedition had landed slap down in the middle of a small orc empire. Fortunately, it hadn't expanded to all of the viable planets nearby, and the two ethereal leaders that had come along with the expedition, Aun Los and Aun Diamond, were happy to allow Farsight to do what he thought was best with the orcs whilst they were setting up the beginnings of Tau civilization. As this was first and foremost a colonization effort rather than a military campaign. The Tau had kind of been hoping that there wouldn't be anything they needed to fight here to begin with, but, well, that proved to be wishful thinking, as the orcs in the area were commanded by a near uniquely willy war chief by the name of Grog. Grog is not the name you'd expect to hear. Associated with great tactical cleverness and strategic wiles, but that was exactly what Grog possessed in spades. In fact, Grog was easily able to outmaneuver Commander Farsight on several occasions, leading him to suffer a string of humiliating defeats at the Warchief's hand, and even saw mass devastation inflicted upon the new colonies, including bombing an entire planet and its primary civilian center with meteors. Classic orc tactics. But O'Shovah's repeated failures to deal with an orc strategist, is not really the focus of all of this, so we can skip ahead a little bit. He did eventually, after submerging himself at the bottom of the ocean, figure out how to begin defeating the orcs. And this is where O'Shovah's deviation from the Ethereals really started becoming more pronounced. He'd already begun developing a fair bit of doubts during the Damocles Gulf crusade, because the Ethereals had of course explained to the Tau that the galaxy was theirs for the taking. This, obviously, wasn't true. If they were lying about that, what else were they lying about? Well, O'Shovah had previously been chastised for thinking too much along the lines of other castes, but he could come up with no effective way to defeat the Greenskins that didn't require much closer cooperation with the other castes. Indeed, when he returned to lead the war effort after having abandoned it for several months, which is apparently something a Tau commander can just do, he started using the other castes in new and interesting ways in combination with his own fire-cast warriors. It was this that allowed him to achieve final victory over Grog. Although Grog did escape. So hopefully we will see a continuation of this somewhere down the line titled Grog's Revenge. But after having defeated his green arch nemesis, the really interesting part happened. See, there was one world remaining. Actually several, but without Grog to lead the war, these worlds were in essence just isolated orc planets without a real command structure or war chief to lead them, making them fairly easy prey for the now reorganized Firecast under Commander Farsight. However, one planet was to be an exception. This was Arthus Moloch. It had one of the largest concentrations of orcs, not even just merely remaining, but that had ever been seen in the area. We're talking apparently millions. How many Tau Fire Warriors this expedition brought with it to even consider taking on a planet covered by millions of orcs? I don't even know. The logistical feat must have been pretty damn significant, especially considering the quantity of civilians they brought along as well, but details, it's Games Workshop numbers, so just roll with it. Obviously, O'Shovah could not allow such an enormous power center of orcs to remain within this new region of Tau space. O'Shovah knew exactly what would happen if he did. Indeed, O'Shovah committed himself to a very detailed and conspicuously Earth-casty research of the orcs known as the Book of the Beast. So he fully understood how the orcs, well, you know, evolved and grew more dangerous as a society with the arrival of a war chief, and he understood the processes behind the selection of such a war chief. And a planet that already had millions of orcs on it, there was only a question of time until another orc chief arose, and he would be a significant threat, as he would have been able to cow all of those millions of orcs. Now, if that was the only problem, then it wouldn't have been that bad. After all, yet again, the orcs' previous war chief, Grog, had already been defeated, and thus he would not be there to lead the defenses. What the Tau did not know, and even if they had known, they wouldn't have understood the significance of it, was that Arthus Moloch had already been settled, probably been settled quite a few times, really, but most importantly, it had been settled by the Alpha Legion, who had presumably planned to use the distant and isolated planet as some form of a base area, either as a part of a grand scheme, mayhaps, or simply because that's where they ended up after the Horror's Heresy, and it was considered so far out on the fringes that it was unlikely that the Imperium would ever bother following them that far out. And indeed, it didn't. The Imperium was either blissfully unaware of the Alpha Legion's presence on the world, or had not the resources required to, well, send them all the way out there to deal with what was, in all due likelihood, a fairly insignificant outpost. Indeed, the Alpha Legion themselves would eventually largely abandon the outpost, but not before leaving behind the seeds of a little chaos-corrupted civilization, and perhaps a few of its own Astartes as well, working away at whatever long-term scheme they might have had in place. All of this, however, was brought to an end in the 39th millennia, when the Scythes of the Emperor, the best and coolest chapter, by the way, purged the entire planet, both of its heretic and mutant population, and of, well, everything, as they simply glassed the whole thing from orbit. A measured and reasonable approach, in my opinion. They did not, however, go the extra mile to disassemble and destroy all of the countless things, altars, and objects of worship that the Alpha Legion had built on the planet during their occupation. And to be fair, not only would that have taken a very long time and a lot of bother, but it could also have been extraordinarily hazardous. The planet was deep on the fringes of the galactic space, after all. It was unlikely that anyone would just happen across it and not understand the significance of a humongous 8-sided dais with an altar at the center. But, as fate would have it, the Tau, of course, had no idea what any of that meant. And so they descended upon Arthus Moloch in force to wipe out the orcs in massive, huge battles where unfathomable quantities of blood ran all around and over the altar. Yeah. I'm sure you can venture a guess as to what happened next. Demons. Demons happened next. Lots and lots of demons, as the giant 8-sided altar was exactly what everyone else already knew it was. Hell, I'm pretty sure even the orcs had a general inkling. The reason why they'd gathered here was probably to ensure that they'd get even more playmates, if by some miracle they managed to deal with the Tau. Plus, the orcs must have been a bit annoyed by now by the Tau's preferred strategy of shooting and scooting. But to the Tau, of course, this was an enemy they had never before seen, that appeared to operate with rules beyond this universe. Normally, running naked towards a firing line of Tau plasma rifles would be a pretty quick one-way trip to hell. But not in the case of these creatures, as mysteriously they seem to soak up plasma fire. Each abnormal aberration taking far more damage than it had any right to do. And there was an astounding variety of creatures as well. Red-skinned demonic things with tall, curved horns. Screaming, flying, disc-like things, swooping and flitting through the air, while firing streams of fires from their mouths. And all apparently being led by a giant bird monster, of all things. Farsight himself, at the moment when the Chaos Rift began to open near the center of the altar, was way too close for comfort, and had been exposed directly to the vagaries of the warp. Explaining later that he had stared directly into the portal and seen an entire universe of horrors, the likes of which stole his breath away and robbed him of all sensibilities. But getting away with merely fainting after staring into a fully fledged active hole in reality, O'Shovah was rather lucky, but deprived of their military commander, and also, unfortunately, from their ethereal commanders, the rest of the Tau were now left leaderless and isolated. There were none who could take direct command, and even if there were none who had the vision required to understand and react quickly enough to this utterly unknown foe that seemed to operate on rules completely separate from anything the Tau had ever seen. Understandably enough, a planet-wide emergency evacuation order was given. The Tau would attempt to flee the planet as quickly as possible. No mean feat, even that, considering the fact that they were currently embroiled in a mass conflict with an enormous quantity of orcs, and now under assault by an unknown enemy whose capabilities too were simple guesswork. The Tau didn't even know if they would be safe in orbit, and in all due likelihood, they wouldn't have been. But before the evacuation could come fully underway, Farsight regained his senses, and with remarkable swiftness analyzed the situation, realizing that they were up against an enemy that was clearly abnormal and highly unusual. He reacted near purely on instinct, understanding that whatever this threat was, it could only be dealt with through exceptional and unique means. And if the threat was not dealt with, well, if the Tau had come to Arthus Moloch because there was no way they could possibly tolerate an orc presence on the world, this was a hell of a lot worse. O'Shovah hurriedly ordered his troops to split into 3 roughly equal combat groups. One would continue attacking the orcs and cover a potential retreat. Another would be sent towards the heart of the dais, where they would engage 3 particularly ferocious enemy creatures. 3 greater demons of corn, by the way. I do absolutely love the scale of this too. Millions of orcs and a chaos invasion led by 3 greater demons. Oh, and a Lord of Change, of course. Christ. Most Space Marine chapters have never seen action like this. But simple military might was not going to be enough to win this battle. O'Shovah had realized that he needed items of power to close the rift. He had ordered some of his Tau to go out and secure a series of medallions in the shape of the altar itself, and he had personally claimed a sword from the middle of the deities. Now, how exactly he understood that all of this could be combined in some ritualistic fashion to close the gate, well, there are some potential theories. Perhaps his close brush with chaos by staring into the portal had imbued him with a measure of occult knowledge, or some level of instinctual understanding. Or perhaps, during the reclamation efforts in the Damocles Gulf, he had studied his enemy, the Imperium, their mysteries, their history, and their mythology. It would make a great deal of sense. After all, O'Shovah had proven himself to be a occasionally dangerously inquisitive individual. His curiosity may well have driven him to study his enemies and even what appeared to be utter and complete nonsense. Regardless of where he gained the knowledge from, it was the right knowledge. And he had also managed to extrapolate other pieces of valuable information as well, such as that blood powered their enemies. He ordered any warrior that was wounded in battle to immediately retreat from the deities, for the majority of the fighting as well to move away from it as quickly as possible, and for crises battle suits to move around the deities, attempting to burn off any traces of blood found on the altar. Now, in reality, this wouldn't really do all that much, as the mere act of spilling blood, violence in and of itself, is what powers Khorne, not just the blood in and of itself, but this act of ritualistic desecration clearly drove the demonic creatures into a rage, and made it easier for the Tau to deal with them, distract them, and pull them away from O'Shovah, whom, gathering a small group of elite battle suits around himself, which would be the initial formation of his favorite elite cadre later on in his career, launched a rapid-moving spear tip towards the center of the deities and the rift into reality. Any other creature attempting to do this would probably have their souls ripped out of their bodies before they got halfway there. But as the Tau are extraordinarily dim lights in the eyes of the Immaterium, they could get close enough to strike at the portal itself with the ritual weapon and the strange medallions. This caused an occult chain reaction that, luckily, closed the gate. I mean, for all O'Shovah knew, he could have made everything a hell of a lot worse as well, but it didn't. Cut off from the warp, their lifeline, the demons quickly began to fade and flicker and disappear, leaving only a handful of bruised and battered orcs, having been caught straight in the middle between the Tau and the demons. Thus, Arthus Moloch became a Tau victory. An extremely expensive Tau victory, but a victory nevertheless. It was, however, also to be a transformative point for Commander Farsight and the entirety of the Farsight expedition, as found on the field after the battle were the bodies of the expedition's two commanding Ethereals, Aun Los and Aun Diem. The Farsight expedition was now, technically, leaderless, as there was no precedence whatsoever for a non-ethereal to lead such a large group of Tau, especially not this far away from the rest of the Tau Empire. But Commander Farsight wasn't feeling particularly leaderless. He wasn't feeling lost or bereft of the guiding light of the Ethereals. In fact, he was beginning to feel as if the wool had finally been pulled from his eyes, as more and more little things started to click into place. Firstly, he expected to immediately feel as if he had been cast adrift. After all, the Ethereals' position within the Tau hierarchy, their caste elevated above all others, was because they were supposed to be the natural leaders of the Tau. They were the ones who knew the truth, that understood the Tau's divine destiny, and could interpret the greater good. They were the ones who determined what the greater good was at any given point in time, a skill, a talent, an ability that no other Tau truly possessed. And surely, without this, without access to a oracle of the greater good, how could Commander Farsight possibly even begin to interpret its will? And yet, he did not feel this. If anything, he felt a greater degree of clarity than ever before. Had he not been the one who had saved the expedition on Arthus Moloch? Had he not been the one who had chased down Grog? Had he not been the one who had gotten off Arthus Moloch, who had gathered together the shattered and scattered disparate portions of the expeditionary fleet? Had he not been the one who had kept them all together during those dark days immediately after the death of the Ethereals? And furthermore, not only had he achieved this, but he felt no particular drive or compulsion to return to Tau space. The more and more he thought about it, the more and more he came to the conclusion that he was apparently doing quite fine by himself, and that the rest of the Tau as well appeared to be sharing this same idea. And he had been dispatched with a mission. He was ordered to colonize this area of space and to prepare it for defense against any other external foes. He might as well finish his task before returning back to Tau space, right? I mean, now that the orcs were defeated and the strange aliens were no more, everything seemed to be going quite okay. There was also, of course, the appearance of the aforementioned odd alien creatures with their hellish red skin and fiery swords that appeared out of nowhere. If the Ethereals truly were omnipotent guides to the entire Tau race, then why hadn't they told anyone about these things? Why hadn't they warned the Tau military that these creatures existed? Why hadn't they explained that they required very specific and specialized tactics to deal with? And whatever scenario O'Shovah came up with to explain it, it only made matters worse. If the Ethereals were ignorant, then they were not the omnipotent guides of the Tau species. They were simply fallible leaders, and yet they had appeared infallible to O'Shovah and all the other Tau for as long as they had been close to them. This was strange. suspicious even. And if they had known about these creatures, then they had clearly failed in their duties as leaders, with their responsibility to inform their subordinates to the best of their abilities. O'Shovah could find no way to reconcile either failure with the greater good. By the time Commander Farsight had completed his mission of fully establishing his new portion of the Tau Empire and fully fortifying it against any external threats, he no longer felt any urge to return to that very empire, nor to the Tau under his command. Worse still, O'Shovah had begun to doubt, far more so than merely the logic or wisdom of the Ethereals, but as their apparently odd control over him faded more and more every day, he came to the conclusion that whatever the Ethereals had done to him and to the Tau of his expedition, it sure as hell was a fuckload more than a charming smile and some book smarts. He even began to suspect that the Ethereals might somehow enforce a very unsavory form of control over the Tau, directly, in a way that would violate their very independence as living beings. Now, news, of course, spreads rather slowly in the Tau Empire, as they do not have astropaths. They don't have psychics that can hurl messages over interstellar distances with ease. The only way that the message would reach the rest of the Tau Empire was either through messenger ships, which would travel quite slowly. Again, I remind you the Tau had to be frozen to get to where they were now, so it would take a very long time before news arrived this way, or via simple signaling, which would also probably take years and years and years, quite possibly decades or more. By the time the news of the Ethereal's death did arrive in the rest of the Tau Empire, obviously orders were immediately dispatched that O'Shovah should return home with all haste, and that he should submit himself to the Ethereal's councils as soon as he arrived. By the time that order finally made it back to Farsight's Enclave, his only response was to begin fortifying the planets nearest to the Tau Empire as well. Commander Farsight recognized that whilst the Ethereals were not the answer, though, he wasn't entirely sure he was the answer either, especially as he had begun to question everything that he had based his entire life, career, and faith upon. He gave over the command of the Farsight Enclaves to a series of administrative advisors, who seemingly agreed with his decision to not return to the rest of the Empire. How exactly he pitched all of this to them is somewhat unclear, as Farsight himself believed that he could not inform the rest of the Tau of the true nature of the Ethereals. If he were to do so, he thought, then they would overthrow the Ethereals completely. And the only result that would stem from that would either be some form of single-rule tyranny, one of the other clans taking up in essence the mantle of the Ethereals, or the Tau species simply beginning to fracture and break apart, letting them become easy prey for the countless hostile creatures out there in the galaxy. Another thing that O'Shovah wouldn't have really been able to fully understand himself was that he had stared into a warp portal, an experience that had done some interesting things to him, physically as well as mentally. O'Shovah had decided to wander off into a more or less self-imposed exile away from the Enclaves after having given them general instructions on how to comport themselves. He expected to eventually, well, die after having been away for long enough, either due to natural causes of old age or having pissed off a creature large enough to put him into the ground, but he didn't. The years came and the years went, and O'Shovah did not age like a Tau should. He did not weaken, and he certainly did not fade away and die. He lived twice the age of what a Tau should, 3 times and more, and still there was no sign of his imminent natural death. His thoughts, too, remained the same as after the death of the Ethereals, apparently liberated from their influence, but also turning more and more inwards as to what the true nature of the Tau should be. Nor was his unnatural longevity the only thing that had changed. Farsight made several unusual choices. For example, hanging out with an artificial intelligence quite early on, one that he had built up and improved over multiple iterations. Now, the Tau do have a degree of AI already in their drones, but this rather special AI, even capable of piloting a crisis battlesuit, appeared to possess intelligence far, far beyond that. Well into abominable AI territory. Nor was that the only oddity around him either. He seemed to grow rather attached to the number 8, for example. He would have 8 personal bodyguards, and his special cadre of elites always fighting nearby him and around him would number 80 members. That's a lot of sacred numbers there to certain powers off in the warp. And if it weren't for the fact that O'Shovah would later go on to somehow resist being turned into a demon prince, it would be seeming pretty obvious what had changed his mind, even more so than being deprived of the constant mind control sniffies of the Ethereals. But we shan't go all the way to the end of O'Shovah's career. Instead, let's talk about his brainchild, the Farsight Enclaves, as they reveal some rather interesting little tidbits about the Tau. Firstly, any idea that the Tau might remain a unified race without the Ethereals have quite quickly and immediately been dispelled in the Farsight Enclaves, as the various castes have claimed their own planets, and whilst there is some overlap, the castes cooperate. The Earth caste still creates weapons for the Fire caste and so on, and they can visit one another's worlds. They clearly prefer to be separated. The Earth caste stay mainly on their world of Lub-Grael, where they can continuously excavate the planet and build new facilities for research, for agricultural science, for studies, for archaeological experiments, etc., etc. The Earth caste love building, and that's what they're doing there, constantly and continuously. Meanwhile, the Water caste isolated itself on Salash Hay, the Air caste on Tinik La, and the Fire caste on Viorlos. The segregation even goes one step further, as the Tau's allies that they presumably brought with them, the Guevesa, largely the human populace that had been absorbed into the Tau Empire before and after the Damocles Gulf Crusade, they have been given their own planet as well, Guevesa Rio. And, naming the planet Guevesa Rio is kind of like calling it Planet N. But oh well, details. This voluntary segregation proves very clearly that the various castes would prefer to remain as distant from one another as possible, and to continue to pursue their own ideas and agendas. But they also understand that they need to cooperate to continue to exist. The air caste need the earth caste to construct their weapon systems for them. The earth caste need the air caste to control the ships, resupplying them and keeping this little series of enclaves well supplied. The fire caste is required to protect all of the above, of course, and the air caste continue to man the military aircraft of the enclaves. But this remains a decision, a cooperation born from necessity, rather than any natural like or want to cooperate, as Commander Farsight has maintained a version of the greater good within the enclaves. He has not moved away from that idea. Indeed, he has reiterated on multiple occasions that he still serves the greater good, simply not the Ethereals. Though this will remain probably a rather flimsy excuse if the enclaves continue to exist and their common shared enemies continue to decline, or perhaps even vanish entirely. If they were to do so, I fully believe that the enclaves would all tear themselves away from one another, or continue the countless wars that had ravaged the Tau home planet before the coming of the Ethereals. The castes are simply too different, too independent from one another. They require some element of central leadership or shared ideology to even make it possible for them to cooperate in the short term. Now, granted, we are talking short term in, galactic scale, so hundreds of years, no doubt, and with a continuous leader like O'Shovah, able to pop by on occasion and reinforce the ideology, a hero of myth, then they may very well be able to continue this collaboration near indefinitely. Unless, of course, someone from amongst their ranks rise and decides that maybe they've got what it takes to be a better Commander Farsight. And it's yet to truly be seen what would happen if the Ethereals returned. Now, clearly, there is some degree of resistance that can be built up amongst the Tau. Otherwise, Farsight's occasional visits to the Tau Empire when it is in moments of great need would have already seen himself and the Tau immediately fall back into the Ethereals' control. As this is not the case, they clearly have either built up some element of resistance, or if they are actually aware of the manipulation taking place, then they are better able to resist it, or perhaps even become entirely immune to it. It's rather ironic that the Tau of the Farsight Enclave would tear themselves away from the smell manipulation, most likely, or other form of brain control of the Ethereals, just to become equally reliant upon and addicted to the control of another. Now, one must certainly then hasten to argue that, unlike the Ethereals, who controlled the Tau through mental and physical manipulation, O'Shovah simply does so because he's the best leader around, and because he has led them and saved them before. But nevertheless, it does seem to be quite self-evident that without him, the enclaves would fall apart, as the various castes would simply continue their self-enforced exiles out of simple preference. Slowly but surely, the water caste would stop talking to the others. They'd stop being the ambassadors. The air caste might decide that their time is better spent working for themselves. The fire caste will decide that there's no longer any real point in extending protection to those who offer no services to them in return, or simply decides that it sure would be nice to force those other castes to continue to offer their services for the betterment of the fire caste. Unless a miracle happens and they all start to mingle together far more frequently and on a far greater scale than they currently are, then it seems virtually unavoidable that the Tau in the Farsight Enclaves will fall upon one another. That it seems indeed that the Tau in a state of nature are unable to truly come together unless unified by some form of external ideology, and even then, only if it is enforced by a leadership caste, or even an individual leader. Fortunately for them, it doesn't seem like O'Shovah's going to be dying anytime soon, as he's been mortally wounded, 3 times now? He's had his leg blown off, he's been nearly eaten by a tyrannid, and I'm pretty sure he caught a bloodthirster axe to the chest at some point as well, which only really inspired him to perhaps consider becoming a demon prince himself. And seeing as he shook that off like it was no big deal, I think we can also quite confidently say that whatever plans the Chaos Gods had to corrupt him, they're going to have to bring along a more enticing reward than merely turning him into a Titan-sized battlesuit, crushing anything and everything before him with an axe. You know, I correct my previous statement that O'Shovah is an isekai protagonist because, well, not even an isekai protagonist is likely to have plot armor quite this thick. But he's going to need every inch of it if he's going to continue to stay alive whilst being hunted by Space Marines, by Chaos, by the Tau Empire itself, and also continue to meddle in the affairs of all 3. And, not to mention, keep his own little enclaves from tearing one another's throats out with their teeth. Best of luck, O'Shovah. Best of luck. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.